All right, here we go. Greetings, everyone. I'm glad you could make it on this balmy Sunday morning here in January for another edition of Art Brunch, where we explore the wisdom of the art, spirituality, and the great ideas. Today's presentation is going to possibly require pen and paper handy. The reason I say that is because I'm going to go through several modern systems of thought briefly only to define them. I think you might want to write down some of the names of these philosophies, these ideas, so you can explore them thoroughly later. Now, you're really going to get your money's worth this morning. When I say phrases like that, what I'm really telling you is that the material is so rich and dense that you're probably not going to be able to digest it all in this presentation. And you're probably going to want to explore some of these ideas more thoroughly and more in depth at a later time. So that's why I think pen and paper might be good for you during this presentation. Anyway, I hope you find it fascinating. Let's see. All right, what makes a perspective modern? We're dealing with modern traditions now. Modern traditions place the primacy of reason and empirical experience over other sources of knowledge, like tradition or like revelation. It began during the Enlightenment, this idea, but went in two distinct directions. With English liberalism, human progress was sought through civil liberties and the spread of democracy. The individual was considered primary, and this idea seemed self-evidently true. But the French thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his book, The Social Contract, argued that the individual finds his true being and freedom only in submission to the general will of the community. The individual was considered subordinate to the group. This, too, seemed self-evidently true to the philosophers that argued for it. Rousseau's philosophy is known as collectivism, and it was given its most powerful argument in the work of Karl Marx. Karl Marx said the human essence is the true collectivist essence. The human essence is the true collectivist essence. Marx wasn't satisfied with academics reading about his ideas. He sought to put collectivism into action. He called for a proletarian revolution. He said the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, unquote. So in much of the world in the second half of the 19th century, we had this battle of ideas between classical liberalism and Marxism. But one figure changed the course of modern thought towards the end of that century. Challenged might be too soft a word for it. I'd say he took a sledgehammer to most of the previous paradigms for navigating life. I'm referring to the German philosopher and writer Friedrich Nietzsche. He is not only considered a pivotal figure in modern philosophy, but in the development of what is known as postmodern philosophy. I'd like to focus a little bit on him since his ideas have had such a major impact on 20th century perspectives. In works like Thus Spake Zarathustra, he announced that God was dead. He championed the individual, but critiqued democracy as weakening the truly great individual. He argued against most ideologies that placed any limitation on the individual pursuit of excellence, and he singled out Christianity's emphasis on equality and morality as particularly harmful to the individual. Greatness founded on the will to power was what mattered. I hope I'm pronouncing this German correctly, Wille zur Macht. He championed the Superman, the Übermensch, driven by his will to power, Wille zur Macht. This is one of his most controversial ideas, perhaps because it has been so misunderstood or maybe better misappropriated, namely by the Nazis. Nietzsche was not a systematic philosopher. In fact, he wrote often in pithy little aphorisms and parables, which left much of what he wrote open to interpretation. Adolf Hitler idolized Nietzsche, but used his philosophy in a way that probably would have angered Nietzsche. Nietzsche made a sharp distinction between the German word Kraft, which means force or strength, you see that on the screen there, and the word Macht, which Nietzsche used, which means power or might. Now, in order to distinguish this more clearly, I needed help. I don't speak German fluently. So I turned to that internet scholar, Wikipedia. And here's how Wikipedia made the distinction. Craft is primordial strength that may be exercised by anything possessing it, while Macht is within Nietzsche's philosophy closely tied to sublimation and self-overcoming, the conscious channeling of craft for creative purposes, unquote. So when an athlete trains their body to make it stronger and faster and more skilled, she is using her Macht. Now, I don't think Nietzsche gets off the hook completely for his influence on later fascists. He could have been clearer in presenting his ideas. And he does set the Übermensch, the Superman, over and against the majority, referring to the majority as the herd. But it is this next idea that makes Nietzsche a truly polarizing philosopher and a foundational figure for 20th century thought. In his philosophy of perspectivism, Nietzsche argues that there is no, get this, there is no essential universal truth because all truth comes from one's perception and interpretation, idiosyncratic interpretation. If there is some grand, godlike perspective existing somewhere, we don't have access to it and we never will. He argued that we are all embedded in a particular time and culture, and we only have a certain amount of experiences to cultivate for wisdom and perspective. And we all have intellectual limitations. We don't possess a 360-degree view of reality. As you may have guessed, this leads Nietzsche toward moral relativism. There is no such thing as morality, he argued, since morals come from one's perception of truth. Morality, then, is simply a tool we use to navigate life. For example, the weak, the herd in society, who are the majority in any community, according to Nietzsche, use the idea of moral standards to check the power of the strong, who would otherwise exploit the weak for their purposes. Many fascists have used such an idea to promote a might makes right societal dynamic. But Nietzsche, I think, would argue that not all moral perspectives are equal. Some moral perspectives facilitate better at personal development and growth than other moral systems. Now, why do we in the West place such a high value on truth, then? Nietzsche blamed Christianity for this, an ideology which perpetuated the idea that truth should be sought as a moral imperative. But it was this emphasis on pursuing truth that ironically and ultimately led to the development of atheism. Like Marx, Nietzsche champions historical and physical explanations, rejecting all metaphysical thinking and writing. So as far as human beings are concerned, truth doesn't exist in an abstract, out there sense, but is based on our modes of perception to help us understand and utilize our environment for specific purposes. That's what truth is. As you can imagine, then, this is not capital T truth, but small subjective T truth. Nietzsche championed the free spirit, the person who thinks differently from what, on the basis of his origin, environment, his class, and profession, I'm quoting here, as you can see, or on the basis of the dominant views of the age, would have been expected of him. He is the exception. The fettered spirits are the rule, who take up their position, not for reasons, but out of habit. Nietzsche's critique was developed during the 20th century into a materialistic skepticism, which no longer accepted transcendent values as either a matter of faith or self-evidently true. Nietzsche's skepticism was against what he called true world theories. A true world theory posits the idea that behind this unsatisfying world of suffering lies a truer world, a hidden one of harmony, affluence, peace, prosperity, happiness, whatever category you want to include. Obviously, most religions are versions of true worlds. But so is Marxism, which posits a whole secular utopian vision as well. But this needs to be made clearer. Nietzsche understood and feared that the death of God and traditional values and ideas might lead to widespread decadence and nihilism. So he's not happy about the death of God at all. He believes it will lead to decadence and nihilism. It was essential then for the artist to awaken within the free-spirited individual, to create new values for a new world. These new values would be life-affirming, empowering, and vitalizing. Listen to this now, allowing superior individuals to rise above the common group. In this way, politically, you could say Nietzsche was more in favor of aristocracy than democracy. Democracy weakened the superior individuals by, I guess, equalizing things to the lowest common denominator. That's what happens in a democracy. Now, he did not champion an unrestrained release of desire and individual passion. He instead called for self-discipline. For example, he was critical of the decadence of some Roman emperors who did not channel their strength and passions to develop personal excellence. They wasted them on debaucherous living. Nietzsche looked to strong cultures such as ancient Greece and the Renaissance, whose cultures practiced self-discipline and provided an environment that enabled individuals to be stronger and feel more alive. Modern cultures, by contrast, at least in Nietzsche's eyes, promoted mediocrity, herd-like thought and behavior. Look at these two quotes from Nietzsche. He says, wherever we meet with a morality, we find a valuation and order of rank of the human impulses and activities. These valuations and orders of rank are always the expression of the needs of a community or herd. By morality, the individual is taught to become a function of the herd and to ascribe to himself value only as a function. In other words, the common individual, member of the herd, does not seek personal excellence, but seeks to accommodate their life to the group, to the community. In other words, they weaken their natural impulses in order to fit in order to be liked. Now, here's another quote I like. He says, but the worst enemy you can meet will always be yourself. You lie in wait for yourself in caverns and forests. He's very poetic. Lonely one, you are going the way to yourself, and your way goes past yourself and past your 7 devils. You will be a heretic to yourself, and witch and soothsayer and fool and doubter and unholy one and villain. You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you become new if you had not first become ashes? So in the modern world of personal development, Nietzsche is kind of revered as a great prophet. Nietzsche thought that modern democracy, liberalism in the classical sense I described earlier, and enlightened social movements all contributed to the regression of modern humanity behind the more vital and powerful individuals, say in the Renaissance. Now, Nietzsche had a profound influence on many forms of modern thought. He's been used to justify, of all things, modifying Marxism into authoritarian communism. You see, Marx envisioned a society in which workers own the means of production. Workers own the means of production. But in communism, governments own the means of production, while forcing workers to subsidize the training and lifestyles of the few exceptionally gifted communist citizens, like their scientists and their athletes. Today, instead of classic liberalism and Marxism, we hear the terms neoliberalism and neo-Marxism, which represent adjustments to these old ideas, resulting to a large degree from Nietzsche's critiques of them. Neoliberalism is the prevailing philosophy of Reagan and Thatcher. Neo-Marxism is a prevailing philosophy in many university humanities departments. I'm going to briefly touch on these. Neo-Marxism, like Marxism, emphasizes the vitality of the group over the individual. But instead of the primary category of economics, neo-Marxism emphasizes one's status in the world and power relationships and how the powerful use these to oppress the many. Neoliberalism is a conservative development from liberalism. This confuses people. Neoliberalism is a conservative movement. It believes the best way to transform societies is through free market-based reforms. Besides free market capitalism, it emphasizes deregulation and less government spending. It's very similar in this way to libertarianism, but libertarianism is a bit more radical, emphasizing personal liberties in all areas of life and viewing taxation as a form of theft. Now let's transition away from economics. Nietzsche's revitalizing of all concepts of truth inspired relativizing of all concepts of truth inspired the 20th century philosophies of secular existentialism and American pragmatism. Secular existentialism and American pragmatism. Secular existentialism naturally assumes a godless world in which the individual person is radically free. Existentialism emphasizes that we are radically responsible then for our own lives. We shouldn't count on anyone else. Their highest virtue is authenticity. Through acts of will, we forge our own unique path in the world. Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre are the two most associated with this philosophy. The other philosophy inspired by Nietzsche's perspectivism is American pragmatism, a philosophical tradition that views language and thought as tools for prediction, problem solving, and action, rather than describing or representing or mirroring reality. All ideologies and scientific theories did not descend from on high, or, listen to this, or even correspond to the nature of reality, but were developed by individuals or communities to serve some purpose. So truth is utilitarian in nature. This is very radical. Pragmatists ask the question, does this idea work in real life? They don't ask whether it corresponds with reality. They ask, does this idea work in real life? William James, John Dewey, and Richard Rorty are prominent pragmatists. Now, I realized early in my research that if I tried to give more extensive summaries of all of these philosophies, then most of you would be asleep within 10 minutes. Perhaps some of you are asleep right now. Please wake up. But I hope these few sentences, descriptions I've offered are at least adequate and encourage you to explore some of them more deeply. Now, there are two categories that most of these philosophies fit into, and I think that will simplify things greatly. Two categories that will simplify all these philosophies. All Marxist-based perspectives and all classical liberal perspectives can be grouped as collectivism and individualism, respectively. Collectivism and individualism. Most people interpret the world through one of these perspectives. Individualism is the belief that the most sacred entity in a society is the individual person. Collectivism, in contrast, believes the most sacred entity is the group. Individualism prioritizes personal rights and freedoms. It values autonomy and free expression. It emphasizes independence. It promotes personal freedom and responsibility towards one's own growth and development. You could say Lucifer was the first individualist. To the tune of Frank Sinatra, one of his famous melodies, he did it his way and was kicked out of heaven for it. Individualism promotes equality of opportunity. Systems like laissez-faire capitalism, neoliberalism, libertarianism, the Western world in general, subscribe to individualism. Now, before I move to the next one, here are some dangerous trends associated with individualism that come under attack from critics. Individualism tends to develop hierarchical societies with powers in the hands of the few. In other words, oligarchies. Inequality of power and resources naturally develops. Greed and ambition are necessary to sustain the economic system in an individualistic society. In fact, greed and ambition are rewarded virtues in an individualistic society. In collectivist societies, individuals define themselves in relation to others. For example, I'm a member of such and such group. Collectivism emphasizes interdependence. Decisions are based on what is best for the group. Compromise is favored when a decision needs to be made to achieve greater levels of peace. In contrast to equality of opportunity, collectivism promotes equality of outcome. Example, socialism, obviously, and neo-Marxism, which replaces an emphasis on economics with the categories of status and power relationships. Now, what are some of the dangerous trends associated with collectivism? Well, these include the loss of personal incentive in one's job. This means that productivity requires increased governmental control and the eventual erosion of personal liberties. There's often a gradual erosion in one's sense of obligation toward their neighbor. So government has to continually enact coercive measures on its citizens to serve the best interests of the state. Where do you stand? Are you more an individualist or a collectivist? Well, let's return to American-style pragmatism, which I believe can shine a light of critique on these two perspectives. I'll go ahead and admit to you, I first absorbed American pragmatism in graduate school, and it did have a profound effect on the way I view all other philosophies. So let's use it as a lens of critique on some of these movements. Recall that in pragmatism, true statements are not true because they correspond to any sort of reality. True statements are true because they are useful. They have some utility in that they help us cope with the world around us. I know this sounds radical, but wait until you see how it applies to these modern philosophies that we've examined. William James was the first great articulator of the philosophy. He wrote, "Pragmatism, on the other hand, asks its usual question. Grant an idea or belief to be true, it says. What concrete difference will its being true make in anyone's actual life? What concrete difference will its being true make in anyone's actual life? How will the truth be realized? What experiences will be different from those which would obtain if the belief were false? What, in short, is the truth's cash value in experiential terms?" In other words, the validity of an idea, a movement, is determined by its cash value or by how well it works. So let's apply pragmatism to the collectivist system of Marxism and the individualistic system of libertarianism. I chose these because they are the most ideological in nature. Now, I have simplified each system with a crude equation, imperfect for sure, but I think you will get the point of this exercise. In Marxism, we have this kind of equation. Resources plus productivity, plus communal incentive like love of one's neighbor or the hope for a classless society, this will equal a healthy society, such as one where profits are shared equally by all workers. That's an equation of Marxism. Here's an equation for libertarianism. Resources plus productivity plus individual incentive, such as the desire for riches or excellence or fame. This will equal a healthy society, where the individual receives rewards based on merit. Now, in actual history, how have these two systems worked? Marxism led almost immediately to authoritarian communism, where the fruit of one's labor was not owned by the workers as originally intended, but by the government. And as for libertarianism, there are no examples of a truly libertarian country or state, even though there have been several attempts to establish one. Why has this been? Because all attempts at a truly libertarian society end up being modified by legal restrictions due to national self-interests. A country imposing a tariff is anti-libertarian, yet all countries do this. Making marijuana legal, but prostitution illegal, is anti-libertarian. So not all freedoms are guaranteed. What's the problem then? Well, neither equation has worked well because each is missing the human variable. The human variable. Are we really fallen in nature? What is human nature? Whatever it is, whenever you put the H in those equations, it kind of mucks it up. As far as the Marxism equation, introducing the human variable means motivation to work continuously hard for the sake of others is nearly impossible to maintain without coercive measures from the government. And that naturally means personal liberties gradually erode in such a society. As far as the libertarianism equation, introducing the human variable means recognizing our natural impulses toward greed, power, and excess, which ultimately diminishes competition and the freedom of opportunities of others. Case in point, recall that the robber barons of the early 20th century formed trusts which derailed freedom of opportunity by getting rid of their competition. They influenced, or perhaps the better term is bribed, politicians to enact legislation favoring themselves and penalizing competitors. Another problem, the pursuit of profit naturally means seeking the most productivity for the least amount of compensation, leading to exploitation of workers. William James wrote, and I love this quote, "By their fruits, not their roots, shall you know their truth." That is how you judge the truth of any philosophical, economic, religious, or even scientific perspective according to pragmatism. Not whether it is based on a sacred tradition or an authority figure, but on the actual fruit it bears in real life. So a pragmatic critique of both collectivist and individualistic philosophies exposes both of them as ideologies. Both individualists and collectivists regard the validity of their perspective as self-evidently true, because in theory they make rational sense. But I think we can see that when applied in the real world, you have to put in the human variable. And so neither philosophy works in the way the respective leaders and champions argue. Well, what are the alternatives then? Well, what about an individualism modified with some collectivist policies, or a collectivism modified with some individualistic policies? Say the way many Western European countries are now designed. Even the United States, which is often thought to be a purely individualistic society, has some collectivist policies to mitigate the problems that a purely laissez-faire economic system have presented. So we have antitrust laws. We regularly impose tariffs, penalizing foreign businesses. We have both individual and corporate welfare protections. We have Medicare and Medicaid, and we have Social Security. And yet, when we tune into our news, we constantly hear politicians argue against any regulatory protections, or we hear some very far left academics and intellectuals bashing capitalism. Each party acts as if their respective philosophies are capital T true. Pragmatists argue that our pursuit of a true political or true economic or true spiritual system should really be seen as a research project, studying what has worked well and what hasn't worked well, and then continue to modify our strategies and ideas based on changing circumstances and new information. That's the best we can hope for. Small t truth that leads us to a better way of life. This is a portrait of Isaac Newton by Godfrey Kneller. Alexander Pope, the great poet, said, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Newton's ideas seemed absolutely true, capital T true, to the scientific and enlightened community during his day. And then along came Einstein, whose work showed some of Newton's ideas were no longer true. And now modern physics is calling into question some of Einstein's ideas. Where then can truth be found? Well, perhaps capital T truth can't be found, but small t truth can be found. And so application of this idea of pragmatism leads us to the kind of wisdom Socrates advocated. He was known to be the wisest because he didn't claim to know capital T truth. He emphasized a spirit of humility in our pursuit of knowledge and small t truth. And this implies a spirit of grace, a non-judgmental attitude towards those who disagree with us. And so in closing, I have a couple of questions. What do you believe as far as these systems you've learned about? Do you believe in capital T truth, in its attainability? Or are you sympathetic to the pragmatists who only believe in small t truth? Or are you somewhere in between, if that's possible? I'd like to hear your reflections. I know this has been a very dense presentation. There's been a lot of information presented, so I understand if it's going to take time to process. But surely some ideas have popped into your head. Hopefully you wrote them down, some questions perhaps. And so now I open the floor for you to offer them to the community.